Hi, Melissa.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Happy Monday to you.
Thanks, you too.
What's the weather like in Houston today?
Oh, it's hot as usual. Hot and humid.
Okay. All right. Well, let's get started with today. We're talking about the English still. I think last time I showed you this slide, and um, just wanted to touch on a few things here. Again, the starred, or I guess it's kind of like a Union Jack or something, um, indicates a company, um, a company settlement. So the Virginia Company of London and the Virginia Company of Plymouth were associated with the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and of course the Tidewater settlements starting with Jamestown. Proprietary colonies included Maryland and Pennsylvania, and to an extent, North Carolina. I didn't really put that on this, but because I didn't really bring this note all the way up to the front. But I was reading this. There's an older book that I have here. I read a chapter this morning. This is an edited book published in 1959 called 17th Century America. And this morning I read the second chapter, which is, no, actually it was like what was it? Yeah, it was the second. No, it was the first chapter by a historian by the name of Oscar Handlin at Harvard University back in the 50s. And the title of this essay is The Significance of the 17th Century. And he had some really interesting things to say that I kind of wanted to repeat here. He makes a distinction between Maryland and Pennsylvania and North Carolina, which were the proprietary colonies, and the colonies that were started by the companies, by the Virginia Company. And this, of course, was written or published in 1959. So it was written like for the 350th anniversary of the founding of Jamestown. And so now we're in 2020. So Jamestown is over 400 years old. We're almost 410 years old, but it was an interesting read and really short. I think I'll probably post it for you all. But I was trying to remember some of the interesting points about this essay. He talks about how there were there were about three different motivations for people to come to the New World from England, and he kind of gets into what in geography we talk about as kind of a filtering process. And whenever you're talking about migration, in geography we talk a lot about migration. We refer to sort of the idea of push factors and pull factors. And we also have, there's a geographer by the name of Cole Harris. I believe it was Cole Harris who laid out sort of a kind of a theory of what happens when immigration brings foreigners to a new country, to a new land, and what happens to their culture. So let me talk about the push and pull factors first. A push factor is generally one of those situations that convinces someone or maybe gets someone to think about moving, to leaving a place, leaving their homeland. And for somebody to pick up and leave their homeland, maybe for a new country where where different language is spoken and where maybe people have different customs and different religions and so on. That's that you're either really, really brave or you're really, really desperate or both. Who knows? So the push factors in any sort of immigration refer to those things that are sort of the negative facets of your present location, from where you're leaving, the place you're leaving, your homeland perhaps. What are some things that would convince someone to leave their homeland? Okay. And the pull factors, the idea of a pull factor is something that would be an attraction to a new place, or maybe a reason to, maybe the new place would be some sort of refuge from those push factors. So push factors and pull factors. And then there's this idea of what Cole Harris brought up with. Cole Harris's idea, I believe, was referred to, or can be referred to, as cultural simplification, sort of the cultural simplification process. And what he meant by that was, anytime that you have an immigration stream, only a selected number of cultural traits will ever be transferred from the homeland to the new country, especially if you're talking about a transatlantic migration, sort of a long distance migration of people. Now, today, of course, we have dozens and dozens of examples of long distance migration, whether it's, say, Vietnamese families to Houston back during the late 1970s, or perhaps today, the migration of people like Somalis to Amarillo, Texas, or something like that. So long distance immigration happens all the time now, but people try to bring facets of their culture with them, but they tend to only bring and they tend to only get established those things that are most significant to their lives. So that would include things like language and maybe religion, maybe foodways, maybe kinship systems, ways of family, organizing families, and family structure, that sort of thing. Well, certain facets of the homeland get left behind, maybe like things that are easy to change, like fashion, modes of dress, maybe certain types of foods that are not necessarily available. You have to leave those things, and you pick up new things. Maybe you pick up the immigrant picks up new items from other peoples, from the people who are in the place that they moved to the destination. So maybe someone moving from a foreign country to the United States finds there are certain things that are new that he's never seen before, that he picks up and likes. So this process in general is referred to as cultural simplification, because the idea is that you can't possibly bring every facet of your culture to a new place, especially if you're a minority in a new place. The institutions that are required for supporting those cultural items sometimes just can't be transferred. And so you get kind of a cheap imitation, or maybe just the basics of the old homeland in the new place. All right, with all that said,
Can I say something?
Yeah, please.
I thought it was really interesting because it made me really think about it. When you said last time lecture that one of the push factors, and I hadn't thought about that when I was doing my genealogy, but was the second, third, fourth sons that didn't receive anything. And nowadays you don't think about that because it's usually divided, among all kids.
Yeah. The rule of primogeniture, right?
Right, yeah. And I
Primogeniture.
had I forgot all about that when I thought, okay, if they were from a very good family in Scotland or England, why the hell did they come to America? And but you're right, they weren't the first born son, and so you know, there wasn't much that they had, so they might as well try something.
They weren't going to inherit it.
Yeah,
A lot of times they went into the military.
right.
So you have sort of this kind of second class nobility that were in the military, and you know they weren't the common soldiers necessarily, but
Right.
they had connections, but they weren't landed aristocrats. They were soldiers, or they were, you know, military men. So what are can you think of some other reasons that why would people come to the New World from England? Why would they make that dangerous 4 or 5 month trip across the Atlantic? You know, that it was the migration itself, the transportation from England to Virginia took weeks and weeks, and just the risk of dying at sea is probably enough. That it would probably deter me. And I wouldn't
Yeah,
want to.
me
I wouldn't want
too.
to
I
have to.
wouldn't want to do that.
I wouldn't want to eat. I wouldn't want to eat hard biscuits and bacon with maggots in it, and you know.
But my dad's side of the family are religious fanatics, and they would get on the boat thinking God was going to take care of them. So I'm
Okay.
thinking that is a big factor.
All right. So why wouldn't you just stay in your home country and be a religious fanatic? Just to use
They
your.
were ran out,
They were
like
run
they
out.
were
Okay.
probably from all states.
Okay. So they were persecuted.
Yes.
All right. So religious persecution for sure. The Vietnamese in Houston were persecuted by the communists in Vietnam after the unification of North and South Vietnam, after the United States pulled out of Vietnam in 1975. So the people who emigrated to the United States, many of them were boat people who had been moving around Southeast Asia for years and eventually were able to emigrate to the United States because their families had been friendly with the South Vietnamese who were allied with the United States against the communists. So they were persecuted populations, and you know, eventually some of them eventually made it to the United States. So they were leaving persecution, in a sense, political persecution, because of their beliefs. And okay, so if you were persecuted, then you'd probably have to be persecuted to in a very severe way in order to even consider going across the Atlantic Ocean to, you know, find some kind of freedom, religious freedom. And that was the case. That was the case for a lot of people. But one thing I was reading in this essay this morning that I had never really thought about was, okay, those people who did come because of religious persecution were in the minority. There were a lot more who weren't able to cross to the New World. And of those people who did cross to the New World, they had very, very slim chances of survival, or their chances of survival were not that great. Okay. Not that Virginia was much of a refuge for religiously persecuted people. It wasn't. But one of the more interesting facts that this Oscar Handlin noted was between 1607 and 1629. Okay, between 1607 and 1629, there were about 5,000 people who came from England to the Jamestown area, to the colony. 5,000 people. How many do you suppose were there how many English colonists were in Virginia in 1629? Any guess? There were some families that came, so you would expect some children to be born.
In Virginia, I thought it was mostly predominantly men.
It was, but there were a few families, but not many. Between 1607 and 1629, about 5,000 people made the immigration to Virginia. But in 1629, there were only about 1,000 English folks in Virginia. So they were dying like crazy. They were not surviving very easily. They died primarily of disease, malaria. They died of fevers. They starved to death. They were killed by Indians.
It's a completely different climate.
Completely different climate, yeah. And they were drinking terrible water. They were drinking, and they were settling. You know, Jamestown's location was on a neck of land that was defensible, but they were surrounded by tidewater, and this was the tidal, the mixing zone where you have brackish water. So there was fresh water coming out of the rivers into the tidewater area, and they were drinking some of this stuff, and so it was, it was like we would never do that today. We would know better, but they didn't, and they didn't have a lot of choice. But okay, so religious persecution, and those religious fanatics, some of them who went to Massachusetts Bay Colony, had a mindset that they were creating something new. They were creating a new England. They were establishing a society without all of the faults of the old society. So that's one thing they had going for them. They had a self-conscious viewpoint, and they were determined for sure to survive and to establish themselves in a way that, free of all the faults that they viewed England as having. Okay, so what's another reason for immigration that you can think of?
I mean, being hungry and poor, but
Okay.
being able to get on a boat. So.
Okay. How about indebtedness? There were people who were in serious trouble with debts. And if you were in trouble with debt, you weren't poor to begin with. You had to have been able to lose money, right?
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
So
Did they come over and work for someone else?
Yeah. So typically if people if they wound up going into what we would call bankruptcy today for some reason, sometimes they would get thrown into debtor's prison and be required to work off their debts. But one alternative they had was, of course, and you've learned this since elementary school, to sell themselves into servitude. So they were able to, basically hand their labor over for a period of 6 or 7 years, 5, 6, or 7 years, to someone in the New World, with the agreement that if they labored for that amount of time, then their debts would be forgiven. And what you'll see is that for the planter class in Virginia and Maryland, labor was so scarce. Labor was so scarce prior to the arrival of slaves and prior to the adoption of slavery, black slavery, in the 1690s. Labor was so scarce and so expensive that they were willing to purchase these debtors, basically pay their debts off and pay their way to Virginia over, oftentimes, they didn't have the best of traveling conditions, but they were able to pay for their passage. And once they arrived, those indentured servants would basically be laborers for
Is it
these
true that
landed
it
classes.
it was also like military prison type thing? I mean, not just debtors, but also like um, say for instance, the guys that fought for the Jacobites or
Yeah,
whatever,
yeah, political prisoners. Yeah,
political prisoners, yes.
you'll see a lot of that with the Swedes.
So
The
they were just shipped over, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
New Sweden was basically colonized by prisoners of war. Sweden had conquered, it expanded into Russia, and this was in the middle colonies around the Delaware Bay area, around present-day Philadelphia and New Jersey. But the Swedes themselves didn't bother to come to the New World, but they sent these prisoners who were mostly people from Finland. And so the Finns wound up bringing a lot of cultural traits into the Delaware Bay area that we'll talk about. Um, and then others, there were uh, criminals who were transported to Virginia and later to South Carolina and Georgia. Even Georgia is much later, but early 1700s. But they were brought into those colonies as laborers. So you have debtors who were, willing to try something new. Maybe they were running from something, running from a lot of different people. So they were another group. So we got persecuted people, and we have debtors and criminals, and then there's a third group of people. There's a third group of people that you might consider. Who might that be?
Besides people that want the land, um, let's see,
Well,
religious.
people who do want the land, and that's kind of what I was trying to get at.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Basically, farmers who, or people who wanted to farm but couldn't afford land, and this applies especially to the German peoples and the Scotch Irish peoples who came into Philadelphia beginning in mostly the early 18th century.
When you say Scotch Irish,
Mm-hmm.
do you mean like Northern Ireland area?
Yes, the Ulster colony, Northern Ireland,
Okay.
the Protestant area of Ireland today that was colonized by the English. The English came in and established themselves, and they brought in Scottish Presbyterians mostly, established them in Northern Ireland. And after a few generations, those Scottish families, became acculturated into Irish culture, but they were Protestants. So that Protestant island of Northern Ireland, the Ulster colony, was an area where the English landlords doled out land to these Scottish immigrants in Ireland, and took over that part of Ireland from the Catholics. But the Scotch Irish themselves had fairly high birth rates, and after a time there was no more land for them. So they referred to themselves as Scots. That's Scots Irish. But in the United States, we often refer to them as the Scotch Irish. Okay. So as Sean Connery would say, that Scotch is a drink, Scots are people. So anyway, we say Scotch Irish and Scots Irish interchangeably. But those were people not from Scotland, but from Northern Ireland. And they're the ones who were the primary source for immigration into Philadelphia and Baltimore. And they would go into the back country generally because they were very poor. They didn't have money for land, but they had the willingness to go find land in the New World. So they often arrived penniless, but they were seeking out land for land to improve and land to sell to other settlers. And that's the way that they, you know, they believed they could make themselves wealthier. So it was a search for land, an escape from persecution, and an escape from indebtedness. Those were the primary reasons, primary movers of people, the primary pushers and pulls. The pulls being religious liberty, maybe eventual freedom, and of course, maybe a middle class existence, or at least a less than a poor existence. I'm not sure if there's somebody coming in. I guess I'm not sure if were you able to come into the conference here by yourself, or did I have to let you in?
I think you had to let me in.
Okay. Hopefully I'm not missing anybody here. All right. So of those proprietary and company colonies, one thing that Handlin mentioned here was that, and I thought there was a really good point, was that in the companies, you had mostly people who were seeking religious freedom, as in Massachusetts Bay and New England generally. And in Virginia, they were mostly seeking land for agriculture and trying to maybe claim their wealth where they couldn't because they were second sons or something. In the proprietary colonies, Maryland, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, what we see is an attempt by the proprietors of those colonies, whether they were William Penn or Cecil Calvert in Lord Baltimore, or in the case of North Carolina, they were actually a consortium of people, including some pretty famous English philosophers, or English, well-noted English people, which we'll get to later. But those proprietary colonies attempted to transfer what we might call a medieval system of land holding to the New World. So the idea was that they were going to establish a landed gentry with sort of the peasant class, you know, the peasants who would then serve landed families, families who controlled small, lords and ladies who had claim to the land. So the land would only be owned by these wealthy families, and then the peasant class would be transferred to them. So they were trying to create a new system of sort of a new landed gentry in the New World. Well, that was a pretty big experiment. Not so much William Penn, but definitely Lord Calvert, and definitely in North Carolina, they tried to do that at first. But what they found was that, and in this essay that I was referring to, he made a really important point that the new world was full of disorder. It was full of disorder, and there was no support for those institutions. And so even though people arriving to the New World may have wanted to reestablish themselves, or maybe create a utopian society free of all the problems of England, they were confronted with lots of disorder and sort of, lots of strikes against their intentions. Okay, so that's what I really like for you to think about. What were those impossibilities that were there? What would prevent some landed gentry from getting established in Maryland, for example?
Well, their audience, I mean, it has is sick of it, and so it doesn't matter to them if they were lord or lady in England anymore.
Yeah.
They don't have that back that history of being feared and like almost like the royal family.
The,
Like you
the
don't have
yeah,
that history.
the peasants weren't desperate, right? They could,
Right,
the peasants in America could go somewhere. They could leave,
right.
or they could maybe rebel against this landed gentry, or they had other opportunities. How about in the case of the religious separatists or the religiously persecuted peoples? What might they confront that was different? They might
Well,
be able to practice whatever they wanted to.
exactly. They could just leave with us a couple of people and start something new. They didn't,
And then, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, that's it. That they could just keep moving and establishing their own religion basically.
So there was a lot of room to change, to follow your own belief system or to follow your own practices, and that's what happened, of course, in New England. The Puritans came in. The Puritans, as you know, were not very tolerant of other practices at all, and so there were offshoots of the Puritans. And so the Baptists got started with Roger Williams and Providence, and then other religious offshoots went to places like Connecticut, and so there was always room for change. You've probably heard of the Great Awakenings, right? There was the first Great Awakening in the 1730s. And then the second Great Awakening was sort of after American independence and beginning in the around 1800, but it ran all the way up to about 1850 or 1840 or so. Second Great Awakening, and that period was a period of religious fervor, religious change. Of course, we don't really talk about the Second Great Awakening in this class because we only go to about 1800. But the early religious experimentation was taking place. What about what challenges did the reality of the New World place for these for the religiously persecuted people who wanted to establish sort of utopian settlements or new establish their religion in the New World? What did the New World how did the New World challenge their beliefs?
I mean, I don't know. I would think in every way because everything was a challenge, you know,
Yeah.
the even survival. But and the fact that it was basically a country with no rules. I mean, all these people are coming from countries where um, there was just there's so much order and so many rules for everything. What
Traditions and institutions.
Yeah,
Right.
who you could pray to, how
Yeah.
you dressed, how you did this, how you did that. And I would think it would be hard to gather more than a group of people for anything because you can basically do whatever you want.
Yeah. Freedom was there, right?
Yeah.
Um,
But I'm sure there's other, I'm not sure I got the answer correct because I'm not sure what
well,
it
I
is.
don't say I have the correct answer.
Hmm.
I'm just wanting you to try to imagine. But how about the presence of native peoples?
Well, yeah.
That would change a lot of views. Um, the in New England there was from the very earliest days attempts to try to Christianize Indians and Christianize some of the native peoples who were located pretty close to the coast. But then after a while, the native peoples got a little tired of the population of the English population growing, and you have retaliation, you have violence taking place from either, based from both Indian and English sides. And so, people who may have been peaceful at first wound up being, becoming violent, in order to protect themselves. Sometimes they interpreted that as, divine providence, or, a test, a test from God or something.
Because the people from these countries left all the rules and order and tried to place that on the native people. Like, okay, they've been living their own way, for years, and you left being told what to do, and then you wanted to do that once you got here. It's kind of like ironic, but that's life.
There was a good quote here by, I just ran into this in a different section on this little book. A quote by Benjamin Franklin, if I can find it here, about the Indians. Let's see here. Yeah, here it is. Benjamin Franklin, I don't know when he said this, but he says, "Savages we call them because their manners differ from ours, which we think the perfection of civility. They think the same of theirs." So,
Right.
there's the definition of what I used to, what we learned as ethnocentrism, right? We think we're doing everything right the way we do it, but the Indians thought the same thing. They didn't really think so much of the white man's religion. But another thing that Hanlon brought up was the differences between the first three generations. So the first generation of colonists who arrives, and these are the people who were born in England but made the migration to the New World, and then they have children, and their children are raised up in the new land. They've never experienced the same institutions that their parents knew, and so to them everything's kind of normal. They're living in a wilderness, and they're beginning to, they've never really understood anything other than what they have, and then like their children, the next generation after that, is they're completely removed from the social experience that their grandparents had in England. So here you have something that's, to me, really interesting. You have the emergence of generations of Americans who, they're truly American. They were born in the New World, and they never knew anything other than the bare bones little society that they're born into. So to think of them as really English is kind of odd, So just interesting. One of the interesting points that he brought up. How about the attempt by Virginia planters to bring in indentured servants to the New World, to have them work for them. And a lot of these people who are indentured servants were criminals anyway. Do you suppose they're going to be loyal to these landowners in the New World? What sort of ways? Yeah, they could easily just leave, and break the rules, and nobody's ever going to enforce anything against them. So that temptation to break with social expectations is there. So that's what he was getting at in that essay, is that there's all this disorder, and the colonists arrive with these goals of establishing colonies, establishing religious utopias, establishing plantations, and yet the reality that they confront is so different than what they were anticipating. And that forces them, to sort of change their approach. Things evolve, things don't work out. Okay. So, and that's what makes them American. You know, another thing that we should keep in mind is that for those people who were persecuted and those people who were maybe indebted and those people who were seeking out land of their own, they were the small proportion of the whole to take the risk to just, gamble with sometimes maybe, against the odds. Maybe they realized they only had a 30% chance of survival of 3 or 4 years, but they did it anyway. And all of those, that's kind of the filtering mechanism. All these people are migrating, but they all have something in common. They're gamblers. They're people who were either so desperate that they didn't have a choice, but they probably did have a choice. They were so determined that they were going to try. And who did they leave behind? They left behind those people who were maybe not willing to try, who were maybe more complacent, maybe who were not as brave. So anyway, I like to bring that up, and that has something to do with the development of an American attitude. A can-do attitude. All right. Well, enough of the. I haven't given you any notes here. I should do that. So let's look at some of these other points. I'm talking today about New England, but New England is, as we'll see, another thing that Nostrand talks about in his chapter on New England, chapter 4, which is what you're supposed to be looking at. He talks a little bit about the physical geography of New England. And basically what you'll be getting out of this is that New England doesn't have a lot of really good land. New England is a place where you can't make a very good living as a farmer. You can maybe subsist, but we're not going to see much profit coming out of farming in New England ever. They're able to produce some corn in the Connecticut Valley. They're able to use the sea to make a living, but agriculture would never be very successful in New England. The next section is beachheads to colonies, and what he's looking at there is just the migration, and he does mention Nostrand mentions a work by a historian, and he refers to a historical book or history book known as Albion Seed. You ever heard of that? Albion Seed?
Yeah, I don't remember it.
It's a big, thick book. The author is a historian by the name of David Hackett Fisher, and his idea is that different parts of the United States or the English colonies took on different cultural characters because they received different proportions of migrants from different parts of England. Okay. Now, that England itself, here's a map of England, right? England and Wales and Cornwall. And those are the areas that Fisher, the historian, recognizes as different regions of England. Okay, you ever watch Game of Thrones?
Of course.
Of course. All right. Okay. I'm just a recent a recent fan of Game of Thrones.
Oh,
I
Lord.
just started watching it a few months
I've
back.
seen the whole thing probably 4 or 5 times.
Great. Okay. Well, do you know where the accents are from? They're not, well, some of them, like the Lannisters and you know, the most of the women in Game of Thrones speak Southern England, what's referred to as received pronunciation or the Queen's English. Um, they speak in a proper way.
Right.
But the men, most of the men, except for the Lannisters, of course, speak a Yorkshire dialect. They speak the dialect of the North, particularly not the far North, but like Manchester, the English Midlands. And so they have kind of their Yorkshire dialect sounds very different from the Southern English. Okay. And then you remember Sir Davos?
Yeah.
The Sir Davos has a Geordie accent from the northeast of England, around Newcastle upon Tyne. So that was one of the things that I thought was most interesting when I first started watching Game of Thrones was the dialects. And I did a little looking around, and for some reason, you know,
Like
Yorkshire
from
dialects,
different areas and different neighborhoods.
different parts of England, yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes you'll run into like if they're a soldier, or if there's somebody who's going to get killed pretty early on in the show, you know, like the thugs in Flea Bottom, they'll typically have um, a lower class London accent,
Yeah.
what most people will refer to as what is it called? I can't remember.
Pickney or
Yeah, Hackney, a Hackney
Hackney. I
accent,
knew it was something neat.
a Hackney accent.
Yeah.
And so, but the point of that is that Game of Thrones will make you cognizant of regional cultures within England. These are all English people, but they come from different parts of England, and they have different accents, different, you know, in a way, almost different ethnicity, sort of sub-ethnic groups. Well, that's what Fisher is saying in his book, and that book was written 25, 30 years ago, that the regional migrations, people from the north or people from the west country or people from London and the southeast, made up majorities in different parts of England, and so or different parts of the colonies. He says people from London and southeast England colonized Virginia, and people from people from the north colonized Pennsylvania. And there's some truth in that, but mostly that's been discredited. And but strangely, Nostrand kind of takes that, he kind of keeps that going, and that's why you have this map, this color map here, which I don't really agree so much with, but just within New England, he identifies different areas of East Anglia. East Anglia is like the counties of Lincoln and East Anglia, but that's, you know, this is something that was done by Martin Bowden a long time ago, in the back in the 70s or 80s. But he mapped the source areas. There are a lot of people, like the fishing villages of Maine and New Hampshire and the Cape Cod were colonized by West Countrymen from Bristol, for example. And the north, there's just a small area from Yorkshire. But the point of that, you know, ethnic distinctions within England would have been obliterated in the New World, because you're not going to be able to keep those cultural variations. In some places, there are real slight cultural variations, and you wouldn't be able to preserve those, you know, in the New World. So I kind of want you to take that whole section with a grain of salt.
Okay.
Personally, he does talk about the Puritan village myth, and that is something that's pretty important that you look at, and I'll show you a map of that. And then he talks about the architecture of New England, which I'll tell you a little bit about here. Not necessarily today because we're running out of time, but we'll get more into it. But anyway, here are some notes. Here's some points I also would like for you to keep in mind. And this is just my words. The earliest colonization schemes emanating from England were private. Okay, so in other words, it wasn't the crown. The English crown was not doing this. The government was not doing this. It was private, and it was entrepreneurial to some degree, and they were not successful at first. There was terrible, failures, essentially. Eventually, what would happen, though, is the crown would sort of pick up the pieces and establish what was referred to as a crown colony out of these failures. And so the crown, the government would provide some financial aid to these private companies. And so what you have is the Virginia Company of London, the Virginia Company of Plymouth were kind of like private ventures that had been kind of sanctioned and supported by the state. And that allowed them to survive. It allowed them to sort of muddle on until there was some real success. Thing is, though, you got to remember here, the 17th century itself in Europe was the century when a medieval society, a medieval set of small societies began to amalgamate. And during the 17th century is when we see the rise of the nation state, the rise of the centralized nation state. But American colonization, the English colonies, get started before there is a centralized nation state in Europe. Certainly before there's a centralized nation state in England. But the 17th century would see the sort of the emergence of a stronger nation state in England. Ending, and I think I talked about this last time, or at least in the recorded lecture, I talked about it. One of the most important watersheds in English history is 1688, the Glorious Revolution, the establishment of the English Bill of Rights, basically in which a monarch would no longer have absolute power. And with the Parliament having sort of the largest authority over government, the monarch would then essentially have to answer to Parliament. The monarchy was still important, of course, but no longer would you have arbitrary rule by a monarch who was in power under the authority of divine right. So divine right of kings was annihilated in England in 1688, and it would never come back. So that was really important. The colonies get established before the centralized nation state even exists. And those colonies then would be, they would get rolling during that period of new sort of experimentation and changes in society. But they might as well be on the moon because they were far from any connections to these changes that are taking place in England. I guess there was also a period, we should keep in mind that there was a period when people would come to the New World that they referred to as they called it different things, the starving time, or in Virginia, they referred to it as the seasoning period. So a lot of people who came into Virginia died of a fever within the first 6 months or the first year or so. So in some ways, there's almost like a kind of a Darwinian selection going on here. The historians like to refer to that a lot, but in other words, not everybody was going to make it. So, all right, I'm gonna move on. Next time we'll come back. I'll talk a little bit about this, but for right now, I just want to say that the Virginia Company of Plymouth and the Virginia Company of London have these different claims. So the Virginia Company of Plymouth had this claim from 38 degrees north latitude up to about, well, whatever this is, into Maine. And then the Virginia Company of London claimed from 41 degrees north latitude down to basically where North Carolina starts. So their claims overlapped. And because of that, both companies avoided this middle area. And that middle area then would become neglected to the extent that the Dutch and the Swedes would kind of come in between them. And that's where we get the middle colonies. So that overlap zone was avoided by the companies. So you have distinctive English colonies in the Chesapeake and then the Massachusetts Bay area. All right. Well, that's probably enough for today. I'm running out of time. Thanks for listening. Thanks for showing up, Melissa. And
Yeah, that was fun. And I'm sorry if I dominated your time.
No. Well, you're the only one in class today, so that's great. I appreciate it. Didn't dominate anything. All right. We'll see you tomorrow then, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Stay well. Bye-bye.
You too, bye.